Anatomy of a fingerprint. So the outsidemost layer of your body is skin, right? We all know that, including our fingertips. Our skin, though, is divided into a series of 3 layers. We have the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. Now, the hypodermis we don't need to care about. The epidermis and the dermis we do. The epidermis is the outermost layer of skin and rests on top of the dermis. So in this picture over here, you can see this dark purple boundary. Not tracing this very well, but you get the idea. Is the barrier between the epidermis and the dermis. This is dermis, and this is epidermis. Your epidermis might be very thin, or it might be very thick. It depends on where on the body we're talking about. Your fingertips are sort of in between. It's on your palm. It's a major source of contact and friction with the world, which means you should have a lot of layers of skin there to protect the underlying tissues. Skin's main job is to protect all the stuff underneath. It creates a barrier between the inside of you and the outside of the world. So places where you end up touching and rubbing a lot should have a lot of cells because it's going to be abraded away a little bit more quickly, and you need to be able to shed those cells and regenerate them quickly in response to that so that you don't just wear a hole through your skin in your day-to-day contact. So the epidermis is that outermost layer of skin. It rests on top of the dermis. It might be thin, it might be thick. Your fingertips are somewhere in between. The bottom of your feet are very, very, very thick. The eyelids, for example, are only a couple few cell layers thick. The dermis is underneath that. This is where sweat glands originate. This is where hair follicles originate. And its boundary between itself, the dermis, and the epidermis is bumpy. And there's a couple of different edges of types of bumps. You have these little bumps that you can see in here that makes up the superficial, the outsidemost layer of your dermis. And then these overall make up larger sort of wave patterns that you can sort of appreciate that way. These 2 ridge systems help keep the epidermis glued on to the dermis and it doesn't slip around. There's all kinds of little fibers and stuff, collagen and elastin and stuff that keeps your epidermis physically anchored down, like stapled down onto the dermis. But having this ridgy edge between the dermis and the epidermis, means that when you have some sort of a sliding force that's tugging on the epidermis in one direction, it's got these protrusions that rest into the dermis and prevents it from just slipping and sliding off very easily. These friction ridges, these big bumps, so you have bumps on bumps on bumps, it helps keep you from things from sliding around. The big bumps, the big waves, are going to be visible on the outside of the skin. There's a bump and a bump and a bump and a bump. And these bumps are called properly, anatomically, friction ridges. The pattern of the friction ridges on your fingerprint, on your fingertip, is what makes your fingerprint. On the tips of these friction ridges, it's not just pure skin the whole way through. You have pores, openings to sweat glands. So in reality, on the outsidemost layer of your skin, you've got a ton of dead skin cells because the outsidemost stuff is all dead. Why would you be shedding living cells when you could be shedding dead cells? By the time they get up to that far on the outside, they're all dead. So you have a bunch of dead skin cells, and you also have oil that's been secreted from your hair follicle onto the surface of your skin, and you also have sweat. When you press down on something with your fingerprint, with your fingertips, the surface here of each of these friction ridges makes contact with the surface underneath, and the grooves in between do not. Those surfaces have loose dead skin cells. It's got oily, sticky secretions from hair, and it's also got salty secretions, wet secretions from sweat. These are going to help anchor down some of those dead skin cells so that they adhere to whatever it is that you're touching. The adherence of your dead skin cells, your sweat, the oils in your hands, heck, lotion you've rubbed on, whatever residue from the hand sanitizer is left over, that stuff is what's going to create a fingerprint on a surface that you have touched. Your hands and feet are uniquely abundant in sweat glands. You have sweat glands almost over your entire body. There's some small regions of your skin that don't have any, but most of them have some. But you don't have quite as many almost anywhere except for your hands and feet. They are very, very thick with these sweat glands. Your hands theoretically exhibit bilateral symmetry. Take one hand, take the other hand, and touch the palms together. And you can see that they're symmetrical, they're the same. That's because when you were a fetus, or even before then, when you were an embryo, you were started off with an even number of cells that divided down the middle. And then each side from that middle divided itself into clones. Your left side should be a clone of your right side. Now, there are some small differences. If you look in the mirror at your face, I don't want to get you all self-conscious, but if you look in the mirror at your face, you'll notice that there are some slight differences. One eye is a little higher than the other, or your nose is a little crooked. One side of your mouth is a little longer than the other. That's normal. Everybody has that. There's some small differences. But theoretically, the size of your hands are the same as one another. The size of your fingerprints on one hand are the same as the other. Your fingers are as long on one side as the other. And your fingerprints, maybe they're a little different in some of their minutiae, but overall, they're going to be the same on one hand as the other. That's the theory. So here you can see a close-up of finger skin, and then you can see a fingerprint that the skin would have left. This photo I really like because you can see all these deep ridges in between larger bumps, and you can see the openings to the sweat glands located along the tips of those ridges. These sweat glands don't open up inside those valleys, right? They only open up on the surface. And coupled with, when it makes ultimately like this sticky sort of substance of sloughed off dead skin cells and some oils and that sweat, if you get that dirty and then touch something, you can see a visible pattern from the fingerprint. The white space here all represents these sort of furrows in between ridges, and the black lines all represent ridges. Theoretical basis for fingerprinting. Fingerprinting as a method of identification is based on a foundational assumption that no two people in the world living at a given moment have identical fingerprints. By Galton's calculations, there is a chance of 1 in 64, but remember he was as much a statistician as anything else. His calculations came to that there's like a likelihood of 1 in 64 billion that two people have truly identical fingerprints as one another. That is not super sound. It's based on a lot of what has turned out to be fairly faulty assumptions. But what it sort of ignores ultimately is that, okay, let's pretend this is true, that only 1 in 64 billion people have identical fingerprints. There's like, I don't remember, 7 or 8 billion people in the world at the moment. Gosh, I hope that's right. Anyway, there's not 64 billion people in the world. So theoretically, no two people have identical fingerprints. But identical means identical to a single error in all 10 fingers. If there's a little piece, let's say here's one fingerprint and here's somebody else's fingerprint, and you have a whorl and then, or rather a loop and then a line, and you have all of these other lines around it. Pretend those are sort of, they are very close to identical. And the only difference here is that this line is a little bit different. Perhaps they're in fact different, but if they're so close that our current technologies and methods can't actually tell them apart, they are functionally identical. And there is not a calculation that he had to account for those very, very small differences. Now, finding two people who have such similar fingerprints as one another that they could be mistaken for identical is a subject of research, and it's a very good likelihood that it's going to be extremely hard to find two people with that similar of a fingerprint that they could be mistaken for one another. But there's not really a good mathematical model to quantify that. So you can't really assume, practically, functionally speaking, that you're going to be able to distinguish people's fingerprints to the degree that he claims that you should be able to. Technology can only detect up to a certain resolution, and frankly, you're only storing it with a certain amount of resolution, giving our storage capabilities. As our means of storing data improves, the amount of minutia that can be picked up from fingerprints can become more sophisticated. But you're tasked with a finite amount of space. There's going to be some signal loss in these, and you're not going to pick up every single thing. You also don't have full prints at the scene. You might have part of somebody's fingerprint from one of their fingers, or you might only have fingerprints from the side of their fingers, depending on how they were holding it, or just the tips of their fingers, but not like the pad, the big flat sort of palm surface part of your fingerprint. You might have part of their palm print and their thumb, but not their middle three fingers. You usually don't have a full set of fingerprints at a scene, certainly not on any given one evidential item. This makes proper comparison of fingerprints an awful lot more tricky. The difference between my four-finger fingerprint having a match with anybody else in the world's four-finger fingerprint is not what this calculation was. This calculation was every single point on the assembled content of all 10 fingers is not identical down to 1 to 64 billion. That's not one fingerprint versus one other fingerprint on any one of their other fingers. That is a much, much, much smaller ratio. I couldn't even speculate as to what that number would be. So this also presents a challenge. Now, I think the foundational thrust of this is still probably pretty good. There's a lot of data to suggest that this is basically true, but there's so many limitations that you really have to keep that in mind when you're evaluating fingerprints. And because of that, you absolutely should not be going off of fingerprints as your main source, or your sole source rather, of identification. Another and equally important foundational principle for fingerprinting, a theoretical basis for using fingerprinting as identification, as we've mentioned before, is the assumption that fingerprints do not change over the course of a lifespan. Now, this is pretty true as far as anybody can tell. The pattern itself doesn't change by itself. The size of the pattern might change as you get older, as you grow from a child to an adult. It will change in that case. And the size of it might change if you gain or lose very substantial amounts of weight. If I, am 5'6" and 100 pounds, I'll have skinny little fingers and my minutia will be all very close together. If I balloon out to, 500 pounds on that same frame, the minutia of my fingerprints are going to spread out as my skin sort of stretches and grows. It's not going to create new fingerprint pattern in the furrows as it grows out. It'll just sort of spread everything out. It could be to the degree that it's mistaken for a different person entirely, but I mean, the pattern's the same. You can track that type of information pretty easily for most people these days, so that's not really a major concern at the moment. People's fingerprints can change with use, though, or at least the ability to perceive somebody's fingerprints can change with use. So the pattern will be seen your whole life. But if you have a very, very rough physical job on your hands, if you're a carpenter swinging a hammer all day, if you're a mason dealing with stone, handling stone all day, that constant abrasion in your hands, or even if you're a dishwasher for a long time and you don't keep up with the lotion like you should, these days, a healthcare personnel with all the sanitization and the washing they have to do, that you didn't have to do when these foundational principles were founded. I mean, germ theory wasn't even accepted then, truly. You have cracking of hands, peeling, dryness. You have wrinkles that can form that can obscure these fingerprints. You can have such friction that you develop large calluses to the extent that you might it might be very hard to discern that somebody has a fingerprint at all. They could be smoothed out. Alternately, on other places, you could have rough bumps where the fingerprints become very obvious, but distorted over the rounded shape of that bump. You could try to physically change by grafting or acid scarification of your fingers. Grafting is where you have your fingertip, the pads of your fingers here surgically removed, and then somebody else's fingerprint or finger pad skin gets transplanted onto yours so that you have somebody else's fingerprints. Scarification is where you expose your fingerprints to the pads of your fingertips here, where you get a fingerprint, to acid that is sufficiently strong that it burns away your outermost layers of skin entirely, down to and through the dermis, so that those dermal ridges are burned away in the first place. And as skin grows back over that area, it does not retain any kind of a pattern. There's problems with this though. First of all, with grafting, you've got scarring around the edges. You had to have part of that fingertip surgically removed and then put back on. Even if you have the best plastic surgeons in the world, plastic surgeon's job really ultimately is to reduce scarring, is to make changes to the body and then seal it up in such a way so that it looks as natural and non-obvious as possible. They're like, you can think of plastic surgeons as much as experts in scarring as anything else. You can get the best plastic surgeons in the world to do your fingerprints, and you are not going to eliminate scarring. You can make it pretty gosh darn subtle or basically invisible to the naked eye, but it can still be there. And frankly, if you have the best plastic surgeon in the world and they did manage to put you in a situation where you have no scarring whatsoever based on their skill, your anatomy or your physiology might say, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. Some people scar no matter what. Some people scar more than others. You can probably bet that the types of people doing this aren't the same people as who have access to the best plastic surgeons in the world. So this is going to create whole new, uniquely identifiable patterns on their fingerprints. Maybe the inside stuff is super different, but all this outside stuff is going to be a dead giveaway that something has happened to change those prints. Let's remember too that you have dermal ridges over your whole body. It's not obvious in most places. Your fingertips, you definitely have them. And over places like up here around where your fingers meet your palm, you have some. And you have patterns on your fingers elsewhere as well. You have toe patterns, you have crease patterns in your hands. This doesn't actually help you as much as you like to think. Acid scarification could help smoothing out your fingerprints, but again, you're still going to retain fingerprints elsewhere on your body and even maybe elsewhere on your hand or your feet. You'll also have, frankly, having no fingerprints is super weird and is going to identify you. Most of us are not going to the lengths of scarring off our fingerprints. This is going to be a pretty unique indicator for you anyway.